991 southern Iraq, midnight. The desert is silent until it isn't. A single puff of orange blooms on the horizon, then another, then 5 more, in rapid succession. But there's no thunder, no flash of incoming fire, just fireballs erupting from invisible tanks, exploding before they fired a single round. Inside an M1 Abrams tank, a gunner scans the darkness. He's not squinting through night vision. He's staring at a glowing thermal screen. White-hot signatures of T-72s light up against the cold sand. "They don't even know we're here," he whispers. Crosshairs settle. Trigger pulled. Another Soviet-built tank goes silent, its ammo cooking off in a shower of sparks, 1,000 miles away. Soviet intelligence officers watching satellite feeds from Baghdad can't explain it. These tanks were dug in, crewed by experienced Republican Guard units, supported by anti-tank teams and artillery. The Abrams shouldn't have gotten close. And yet every report from the front says the same thing: T-72s are dying before they even fight. One Soviet field advisor, embedded with Iraqi tank brigades, radios back a chilling report. "We couldn't see them. Not at 2,000 meters, not at 500. They were ghosts. By sunrise, the battlefield is littered with smoldering wrecks. Iraqi formations that were supposed to last for days have collapsed in hours. No American tanks were lost. Not one." What the Soviets couldn't grasp, what they refused to believe, was that a new era of warfare had arrived. An era where visibility was no longer limited by sunlight, smoke, or weather. An era where the side that could see in the dark struck first and won before the enemy even knew they were in a fight. This wasn't just a tactical shift. It was the collapse of a worldview. Soviet doctrine had prepared for massed armor, daylight maneuver, and overwhelming numbers. But now it was facing something it couldn't count or predict. Thermal sights, not flashy, not loud, but the most terrifying technology of the Gulf War, and the one that made an entire superpower's tank doctrine obsolete in one long night. Inside a concrete bunker just outside Moscow, walls lined with maps and photos of used military hardware. A dozen Soviet generals gather around a dimly lit table. On the screen before them, grainy footage shows burning tank columns and retreating infantry. The room is heavy with disbelief. These were not ill-equipped militias or undisciplined units. They were Soviet-trained, armed with Soviet gear, and following Soviet doctrine. The assumption had always been clear. Western tanks were superior in some areas speed, maybe fire control, but the Soviet edge was in numbers, positioning, and discipline. And above all, the night was a great equalizer. At dusk, visibility dropped, and engagements were expected to stall. This belief was baked into every scenario, every war game, every training manual. But what they were watching defied all of it. In the middle of sandstorms and pitch-black darkness, American tanks weren't just advancing, they were hunting. With surgical precision, they eliminated entrenched T-72s before a single round could be fired in return. Soviet advisors embedded in Baghdad scrambled for answers. Reports flooded in describing ghost-like attackers, killing from 3,000 meters away, unaffected by dust or night. Senior Soviet engineers attempted to explain it away. Perhaps GPS guided the tanks, maybe satellites relayed real-time imagery. But even those theories crumbled under the weight of data. Satellite intelligence can't provide second-by-second targeting data. And sandstorms blocked conventional optics. There was something else happening, something the Soviets hadn't invested in, hadn't countered, hadn't even properly studied. Thermal imaging. The Americans had moved past first-generation night scopes. They weren't simply amplifying ambient light. They were detecting heat, engines, exhaust, body temperatures, and they weren't using it on a handful of special forces. They'd mounted them on every frontline tank, while Soviet units were groping through the dark with aging IR spotlights. American gunners were seeing crystal-clear thermal silhouettes of T-72s baking in their own engine heat. It didn't matter how camouflaged a tank was, or how still it sat. In thermal, it glowed. A colonel broke the silence. "This isn't evolution, it's revolution." He was right. But no one in that room realized just how deep the implications ran. Because if seeing meant striking first, and striking first meant winning, then the Soviet playbook had just been reduced to ash. For the Soviet Union, armored warfare was science, a precise, brutal geometry of steel, firepower, and timing. At the heart of this doctrine was one assumption above all range parity. Soviet tanks like the T-72 and T-80 were designed to meet Western armor at similar ranges, often between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. Soviet fire control systems were adequate, not cutting edge. Crews were trained to fight by numbers-coordinated salvos, overlapping arcs, and reliance on massed formations to compensate for individual inaccuracy. At night, this balance was expected to hold. The dark, in theory, would level the playing field. Soviet tanks used IR searchlights and image intensifiers, primitive but serviceable. Night engagements were rare, brief, and often avoided. The doctrine was simple: wait for daylight, use reconnaissance to establish the battle line, then engage in strength. But when American M1 Abrams tanks arrived in Iraq, they brought with them something that had never been accounted for in any Soviet manual fully integrated thermal sights, battle-tested in secret exercises for over a decade. These weren't bolt-on gadgets or prototypes. They were standard issue. What that meant, in real combat, was staggering. While a T-72 crew strained to detect a faint silhouette at 800 meters using outdated optics, an Abrams crew could acquire, lock, and destroy that same tank from 2,500 meters through darkness, smoke, or fog. The window for Soviet tanks to respond wasn't narrow, it was non-existent. Soviet battlefield tactics, honed over decades, relied on maneuvering into a firing position, trading shots in volleys, using mass to overwhelm isolated targets. But now they couldn't get into position. Their formations were being broken up from beyond visible range. Tank commanders never saw what hit them. Even worse, these weren't experimental American tactics, they were doctrine. U.S. units trained to fight at night as standard operating procedure. Thermal gunnery wasn't exotic, it was expected. The U.S. Army had shifted the entire engagement envelope from 2 kilometers to 3.5, and the Soviets were still playing at 1.5. In war colleges across the Eastern Bloc, entire libraries of doctrine were now irrelevant. There were no drills for fighting what you couldn't see, no countermeasures for being outranged. The night, once a sanctuary, had become a death trap. And with every engagement, the Americans didn't just win, they rewrote the rules. January 29th, 1991. 0300 hours. The night air over the Kuwaiti desert is cold, dead still, and thick with silence, but somewhere beyond the low ridgelines, inside a U.S. armored column. The desert isn't dark, not anymore. Inside an M1 Abrams, a young gunner peers into his thermal sight. To the naked eye, there's nothing but blackness. But through the green-tinged screen, the world ignites 10 bright white silhouettes move against a cold background. T-72s in formation, engines hot, crews unaware. Target leftmost tank. Range 800 meters. No urgency, no panic. The fire control computer crunches the distance. The gun slews. A breath. Trigger squeezed. A uranium dart punches out at 1,575 meters per second. A second later, the lead T-72 detonates in a flash of light. its turret launched skyward in a molten arc. The column doesn't scatter, it doesn't even react. They still can't see anything. Another round is chambered. Second tank, same result. A chain of kills begins systematic, calm, terrifying. By the time the Iraqis realize they're under attack, 5 tanks are already smoking wrecks. The 6th swings its gun wildly, firing blind. The shot kicks up a geyser of sand 50 meters off target. Return fire never even came close. What made this impossible wasn't the lethality. It was the invisibility of the attackers. Used tanks, operating entirely in thermal vision, fired from a distance far beyond Soviet tactical expectations and long before a single T-72 had visual contact. Soviet advisors stationed with the Iraqi Republican Guard were stunned. They had trained these crews, they had run the drills. They had reinforced over and over that tanks should maneuver at night to avoid airstrikes and gain surprise. But no one prepared for a force that could see at night better than during the day. No one imagined they'd be picked apart from miles away by tanks they never even spotted. The assumption had always been that victory required mass, momentum, and maneuver. But here, victory required none of those things. It required thermal sights, one Soviet colonel, watching helplessly from a hardened command post, radioed back to Moscow a simple phrase, "It's not a tank battle, it's an execution." It wasn't hyperbole. In less than 4 minutes, the entire T-72 company was annihilated. No U.S. tanks were hit. None even moved. And for the Soviet war machine, which had built an empire on steel and armor, the meaning was clear. Something fundamental had changed. The encrypted report arrived at the Soviet Ministry of Defense by 0900. Initial intercepts from Baghdad confirmed what Soviet advisors had already whispered over scrambled radio. A full battalion of T-72s gone, no survivors, no enemy casualties. The official in charge of reviewing the report, General Leonid Berezin, a decorated armor theorist with decades of experience, reread the transmission 3 times. Each time, he came to the same conclusion. It had to be a fabrication. "This is psychological warfare," he muttered, sliding the document back across his desk. "The Americans are inflating their numbers. Or the Iraqis panicked." He wasn't alone in his disbelief. In closed-door meetings, high-ranking officials from the GRU and General Staff clung to their own explanations. Some claimed the Americans had used aircraft, perhaps drones anything but tanks. Others insisted that the T-72 crews had not followed doctrine. Perhaps their thermal blankets were missing. Perhaps the formation was poorly placed. Perhaps it had never happened. A third theory quickly gained traction, the infamous American myth machine. Washington had a long history of inflating kill ratios and war footage for global media. If it wasn't real, it didn't need to be explained. But the real terror, the one no one dared say aloud, wasn't about Iraqi failure. It was about Soviet vulnerability. If American tanks could eliminate an entire armored battalion from beyond visual range, under the cover of darkness, with a near-perfect kill efficiency, then none of the Soviet frontline doctrines were safe. Not in East Germany, not in Hungary, not anywhere. Still, Moscow's official position remained icy skepticism. When new footage surfaced from CNN showing flaming T-72s glowing through thermal imagery, the Kremlin dismissed it as propaganda overlays. When American press briefings cited thermal gunner footage as evidence of successful engagements, Soviet analysts argued the videos were staged or digitally manipulated. Privately, however, panic brewed. A clandestine meeting was held inside the Institute for Armored Development, where engineers were instructed to review all available footage of the Gulf War and determine if such a technological gap truly existed. The verdict came back 2 weeks later. Not only did thermal targeting exist, it was already second generation. and the Soviet Union was 5 to 7 years behind, maybe more. The myth had been broken. The T-72, once the pride of Soviet armored engineering, had not just been defeated, it had been rendered obsolete, but publicly. Moscow held the line. A statement from the Ministry of Defense declared, "Our armored platforms remain the most reliable and effective in the world. We see no evidence to suggest otherwise. It was a lie, and they knew it." Within the Kremlin's defense circles, silence had become a mask for denial. But the shock of battlefield losses demanded an explanation, and so, instead of confronting the revolution unfolding in desert combat, Soviet military theorists turned inward, clinging to an outdated framework. Their answer came in the form of what would later be known as the environmental misread hypothesis. According to this theory, the failures of Soviet-supplied armor in Iraq were not technological, but environmental. Soviet command concluded that the extreme heat, fine-grained sand, and high infrared ambient conditions of the Gulf region had created anomalies in sensor reliability and crew performance. They suggested that thermal optics might work too well in dry heat, overexposing silhouettes and creating false targets. They argued the Americans were fighting under perfect conditions that would never exist in Europe. It was a convenient answer. By blaming the environment, Soviet strategists could justify doing nothing. Upgrades to tank optics were postponed. Thermal imaging projects, already underfunded, were shelved in favor of old-school chemical smoke deployment systems and anti-laser paint coatings. Commanders told themselves that in the forests of Germany or the plains of Poland, things would be different. But deep down, senior planners knew the truth. The Americans had created a weaponized ecosystem of information. U.S. tank crews weren't just seeing better, they were sharing better. Thermal sights were only the beginning. Real-time targeting data, GPS integration, and digitally synchronized formations meant every American platoon moved as a single, coherent unit. Soviet units, by contrast, were still reliant on radio nets and map boards. But those details were too disruptive to accept. So the Soviet defense community clung to their wrong theory. Internal memorandums described Abrams kills as situational anomalies. Case studies on night combat were quietly removed from military journals. In one notorious decision, a classified doctrine update even removed nighttime armor operations from training exercises, declaring the terrain unsuitable for engagement. The result was tragic. Even as proof of thermal dominance grew, the Red Army doubled down on tactics built for the past. Their top minds were building countermeasures for a problem they refused to define. The Americans weren't just ahead in hardware, they were ahead in thought, and that gap was growing with every hour of the Gulf War. When the environmental excuse began to fray under the weight of undeniable data, Soviet military thinkers reached for another explanation, one that spared their doctrine and absolved their engineers. They called it combat readiness deviation. The theory was simple and deceptively comforting. Iraqi tank crews, despite being trained on Soviet equipment and tactics, had failed not because the systems were flawed, but because the soldiers operating them were unfit, unmotivated, poorly trained, ill-disciplined. Soviet generals pounced on this theory. Memos circulated throughout the general staff claiming the Gulf War was a conflict of substandard combatants. Iraqi troops had insufficient simulator time, maintenance crews had allowed optics to fall into disrepair, ammunition quality was subpar, communications had broken down under stress. In this worldview, Soviet equipment hadn't failed, Iraq had failed. It was a tidy solution, one that upheld the illusion of superiority. But it ignored one devastating fact. The same tactics, using the same tanks, under the same doctrine, would have produced identical results even if Soviet crews had been in the driver's seat. In war, visibility is supremacy, and the U.S. thermal advantage was so overwhelming, even elite T-80 or T-64 crews would have faced annihilation before ever seeing their adversary. American tankers weren't just shooting first, they were seeing first, tracking first, locking first, and firing with pinpoint accuracy under cover of total darkness. Still, the Kremlin found political refuge in the readiness narrative. Instead of restructuring their force or fast-tracking sensor development, Soviet High Command initiated a campaign to tighten training protocols for allied nations. Dozens of reports were drafted on fire discipline, optical hygiene, and decision cycle compression. None addressed the core issue the enemy had turned night into day. The readiness myth also influenced state propaganda. Soviet newspapers described the Gulf War as a humiliation for corrupt Arab regimes rather than a technological revelation. Military analysts appearing on television praised Soviet tank design while ridiculing coalition overdependence on electronics. But inside defense research labs, the mood was different. Engineers whispered about sensor gaps that couldn't be closed. Young officers returning from exchanges with Warsaw Pact allies brought back chilling stories, rumors that even newest generation Soviet tanks were being tracked and killed by invisible enemies during field simulations. One colonel captured the mood in a memo never meant for publication. They see in darkness as we see in daylight. And we are not training for that war. We are training for the last one. But by then, it was too late. The second wrong theory had bought time just enough to delay change until change became impossible. Inside the gray halls of the Soviet main intelligence directorate, maps of American armored units were covered in handwritten notes, surveillance photos, estimated order of battle, known formations, yet none of it predicted what actually happened. Because the decisive factor, the game-changing edge, wasn't a weapon that the Soviets could photograph. It was a capability they didn't believe could exist, an entire armored force that could operate in complete darkness with precision as if it were noon. For years, Soviet intelligence had assumed that any major leap in night-fighting capability would come from airborne platforms, helicopters, bombers, or satellites. But no one had seriously considered that thermal gunner sights mounted directly on tanks could become a force multiplier. The data had been available. It simply hadn't been believed. The KGB had intercepted defense contractor communications about forward-looking infrared systems as early as the late 1970s. Soviet defense journals had cataloged patents related to thermal lenses, heat differential target tracking, and cooled sensor arrays. Yet these developments were dismissed as experimental, fragile, power-hungry, or too expensive for mass deployment. By the mid-1980s, the CIA had already begun distributing false signals, intentionally exaggerating the role of air power in night operations, knowing full well that Soviet analysts would dismiss the growing thermal capacity of U.S. ground vehicles. The deception worked. Soviet agents embedded in West Germany photographed Abrams units during exercises, but mistook the bulky gunner's optics for environmental sensors. Others assumed the devices were laser rangefinders, not full-spectrum thermal viewers. The greatest failure, however, was psychological. Soviet intelligence had long embraced a mirror model if they couldn't do something efficiently. They assumed the Americans couldn't either. So when American tanks began engaging at 2,500 to 3,000 meters in total darkness, landing first-round hits with lethal accuracy, The Soviet intelligence community had no model to explain it. They believed the Iraqis had been ambushed, or that UAVs were guiding the shots. That something else, anything else, was creating these kill ratios. It wasn't until the second week of the Gulf War that undeniable battlefield footage, captured by U.S. tank thermal sites and broadcast worldwide, reached Soviet analysts. There it was, in monochrome white-hot silhouettes of tanks, visible through sandstorms and darkness, being destroyed one by one before they even moved. By then, the damage was irreversible. The intelligence failure was twofold, technical and cultural. The Soviets had missed the arrival of thermal targeting, not because it was hidden, but because it was unbelievable. It had flipped the rules of engagement, and no one inside the Kremlin had even seen it coming. The Cold War wasn't lost by spies, or even by generals. It was lost, in part, by assumptions. To understand how American thermal dominance reshaped warfare, you have to go far beyond the Abrams tank. Because what crushed Soviet armor in the Gulf War wasn't just a new sighting system, it was the fusion of doctrine, design, and digital command that turned American tank battalions into hunter-killer networks. And the heart of that revolution was the see first, shoot first, win first principle, an operational ethos that weaponized perception itself. It began at Fort Irwin, California. In the years before the Gulf War, the U.S. Army launched a radical experiment at the National Training Center. Here, under the unforgiving desert sun, entire battalions were stress-tested in real-time war simulations. Units rotated through live-fire drills against opposing forces outfitted with Soviet-style tactics and equipment. Every engagement was recorded, dissected, and reconstructed. No assumptions were safe. From this crucible, a new doctrine emerged. Instead of focusing solely on firepower or armor thickness, U.S. planners pivoted toward information advantage. How fast could a unit detect, identify, and destroy an enemy before being seen? How could battlefield awareness be layered from individual gunners to battalion HQs? The result, a seamless data chain. Abrams tanks were outfitted with AN/VSG-2 thermal sights, offering crystal-clear heat signatures through smoke, fog, and darkness. Bradley fighting vehicles followed suit with integrated thermal imagers, extending visual intelligence across the column. Apache helicopters hovered above, feeding IR data to ground units. Satellites mapped infrared anomalies from orbit, and in command vehicles, digital overlays offered real-time updates. This wasn't just new tech, it was a new brain for the battlefield. And while Soviet tankers still depended on binoculars and radio reports, UWOW crews were engaging targets they never even saw with their eyes. It was chess versus blindfolded boxing. More critical still was the speed. With thermal sights, American gunners didn't need to wait for the perfect shot. They tracked movement, ranged instantly, and engaged with precision. Tank duels that once lasted minutes now ended in seconds, and the system was democratic. Unlike Soviet doctrine, where elite units received the best gear, U.S. thermal imaging was distributed widely. Even National Guard units in the Gulf War fielded night-capable tanks. There were no second-tier battalions. Everyone could see, everyone could kill. Perhaps most humiliating to Soviet strategists, there was no single weapon to blame. The thermal edge wasn't a super tank, a classified missile, or a wonder weapon. It was an ecosystem of readiness. It was what happened when decades of R&D, simulation-based training, and technology convergence aligned around one truth, that whoever sees first, kills first. By the end of Operation Desert Storm, U.S., tank crews had destroyed nearly 1,500 Iraqi armored vehicles, most before they ever fired a shot. Soviet observers, watching from diplomatic bunkers in Baghdad and intelligence centers in Moscow, weren't just horrified, they were obsolete. The night the humiliation became undeniable began with silence. Not the kind that precedes an artillery barrage or a dawn offensive, but a deeper, deadlier silence. One in which an entire Republican Guard tank regiment vanished from the battlefield without ever firing a coordinated volley. It was February the 25th, 1991. Outside the town of Medina, 60 miles south of Baghdad, the Iraqi Medina Division, one of the best equipped and most disciplined armored units in Saddam's arsenal, prepared to defend its position. Soviet advisors had personally overseen the unit's development. Its ranks included nearly 300 T-72s, entrenched artillery, and overlapping anti-tank positions. Their orders hold at all costs. But the cost was never theirs to decide. At 0217, the first M1 Abrams tanks of the U.S. 1st Armored Division crept into range undetected. Thermal sights pierced the darkness, locking onto clustered T-72s hidden beneath camouflage nets. American commanders didn't order a frontal assault. They ordered a harvest. In less than 8 minutes, 37 Iraqi tanks were destroyed, each kill confirmed by thermal signatures before the dust had settled. Iraqi tank crews, some still in their hatches, were incinerated before they understood they were under attack. The return fire was not just inaccurate, it was absent. The radio intercepts were chilling. Frantic Iraqi officers begged for artillery coordinates, but Soviet-designed systems required visual confirmation. "We can't see the enemy," one voice repeated. "The shells are falling on nothing." By dawn, the Medina Division had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Over 180 tanks had been destroyed. Not a single U.S. tank was lost in return. The battle became the final, catastrophic case study in the failure of Soviet-era ground doctrine. Layered defense, worthless without vision, massed armor useless without initiative. The concept of a night front was exposed as a fiction, one shattered by thermals that turned every hour into high noon for American gunners. Back in Moscow, the humiliation hit hard. Classified footage captured by CNN and night vision-equipped Apache helicopters made its way into GRU briefings. Soviet generals, many of whom had trained Arab officers personally, were forced to watch their doctrine disintegrate on screen. Soviet tanks, shredded before moving, artillery units obliterated mid-radio call, gun barrels still covered, hatches sealed, destroyed in ambushes they couldn't even perceive. One senior Soviet official reportedly stood in silence after watching a 19-minute combat reel. His only words, "This is not war. This is an execution." And it wasn't the only one. Across the desert, American forces repeated the pattern. Engagement after engagement saw Iraqi formations eliminated before they could deploy. There were no tank duels, no maneuver warfare, just the systematic dismantling of an entire armored force built in Moscow's image. To the Soviet Union, the Gulf War didn't just signal a defeat by proxy. It confirmed a technological and doctrinal collapse they were powerless to stop. In March 1991, as satellite images revealed the wreckage of hundreds of Soviet-designed tanks, smoldering in the Kuwaiti desert, something far more profound than a battlefield loss unfolded in Moscow. It was the collapse of a military theology. For decades, Soviet strategic thinking had rested on the iron triangle mass: firepower and speed. The belief was simple that quantity would overwhelm quality, and that layered defenses guided by rigid doctrine and fortified by sheer numbers would absorb any Western advance. But in the Gulf War, that triangle shattered. Thermal vision wasn't just a tactical tool. It was a strategic breaker of worlds. American tanks didn't need to probe defenses or retreat and regroup. They could sit still watching, waiting until targets revealed themselves, and then annihilate them with cold precision. It wasn't maneuver warfare. It was elimination warfare, with visibility as the ultimate high ground. The implications terrified Soviet planners. If the Americans could destroy Soviet-style formations before first contact, before radar locks, before radio coordination, before return fire, then the entire premise of Soviet defense in Europe became fantasy. Eastern Bloc armies, built around Warsaw Pact templates, relied on night to regroup, reposition, and reinforce. But what if night no longer offered cover? What if the very hours designed for rest and redeployment became the Americans' prime hunting window? Suddenly, everything was inverted. Not speed, but stillness. Not volume, but visibility. Not massed armor, but data-driven lethality. In closed-door Politburo briefings, generals scrambled to justify decades of doctrine. Some claimed the Iraqis had mishandled Soviet equipment. Others insisted it was American air power, not tanks. That made the difference. But inside the General Staff Academy, younger officers whispered the truth. The U.S. Army had created a battlefield no Soviet force could survive, and the timing was catastrophic. The USSR was already fracturing, its economy collapsing, its political grip slipping, but it had always clung to one claim of supremacy, that its military machine remained vast, formidable, and peerless in scale. Now, even that illusion was gone. Thermal dominance hadn't just won battles, it had disproven Soviet deterrence. It revealed that the superpowers' armored divisions, once the pride of Red Square parades, were little more than metal coffins waiting to be seen. The ideology of mutual respect through mutual threat, the foundation of the Cold War standoff, collapsed with it. Because in the Gulf War, America didn't just win, it rewrote the rules of war itself. Today, the Gulf War sits in textbooks as a lightning-fast campaign, a surgical victory, a 100-hour ground war won by superior coordination and air supremacy. But behind that polished narrative, there lingers a darker truth, one that still haunts defense circles from Moscow to Beijing. It was the moment perception itself became a weapon. Thermal sights weren't just a breakthrough in sensor tech. They marked the end of blind warfare, the death of parity between opposing tanks, and the rise of asymmetric visibility as the ultimate force multiplier. Soviet generals would never admit it in public, but in private memoirs and post-retirement interviews, some were candid. They had underestimated America's transformation. They thought they were watching new tanks. What they were actually witnessing was a new kind of soldier, connected, informed, and untouchable in the dark. The legacy of that shock still echoes. Russia's modern military, though rebuilt, has poured billions into masking heat signatures, developing IR camouflage, and building counterthermal decoys. Chinese defense planners obsess over informationalized warfare, their term for America's thermal and digital fusion. NATO doctrine now assumes that whoever controls the infrared spectrum controls the night. But the real legacy lives in every drone feed, every heat-sensing missile, every AI-guided targeting system that locks onto a thermal bloom before a human even identifies a target. The battlefield changed in 1991, but its ghost still lingers. Because once a soldier can see through darkness and fire faster than fear can react, there's no going back. The Cold War didn't just end in Berlin. It ended in the desert, where Soviet steel melted under American thermals, and where silence itself became a warning shot.